When we think of IBM, we think of this massive global tech titan. But behind it all was one of the 20th century's most complicated, controversial, and frankly, influential leaders, Thomas Watson Sr. He was a true visionary who built an absolute empire. But his story? It doesn't start with a win. It starts with a spectacular, career-ending fall from grace that would shape everything that came after.
Yeah, to really understand the guy who built IBM, you have to go back to the moment that almost completely destroyed him. We're talking years before IBM was even a thought. A criminal conviction just shattered his reputation. And as the great Peter Drucker said, it was a wound he never, ever recovered from. It haunted him, and it guided every single decision he made for the rest of his life.
So how did it all go so wrong? Well, Watson's story really kicks off at the National Cash Register Company, NCR. He was an absolute star salesman, just flying through the ranks under his mentor, the founder, John Patterson, who was brilliant but also notoriously ruthless. Watson was basically on top of the world, but the very tactics that made NCR so dominant were about to come crashing down on him.
And the collapse, when it came, was just brutally fast. Look at this timeline. 1912, he's indicted by a federal grand jury for criminal antitrust violations. The very next year he's convicted, he's actually facing prison time. And by 1914, at 40 years old, he's fired. Just like that. Kicked out of the only company he'd ever really known. His career was completely in ashes.
Just let that sink in for a second. He wasn't just out of a job. He was a convicted criminal. He had this huge public stigma of the NCR scandal hanging over his head. He didn't have to start over from square one. No, he had to start from, as the source material puts it, less than zero.
So this moment, this total public humiliation, it became the defining event of his entire life. Being branded a criminal in public, that forged an absolute obsession with his image and his reputation. He swore to himself he would never, ever be seen as the villain again. And this obsession, it would become the cornerstone of the company he was about to build.
Okay, so out of the ashes of his career, Watson gets this totally unlikely second chance. He gets hired to run this small, struggling, frankly kind of messy collection of companies called the Computing, Tabulating, Recording Company, or CTR for short.
And his game plan was pretty simple, but it was also kind of radical for the time. First, he just takes charge of this disorganized mess, CTR. Then he completely rebuilds the culture from the ground up, based on the values he now held sacred: absolute loyalty, a perfect public image, and this relentless, non-stop drive. And then finally, in 1924, he gives it this grand, aspirational name we all know today: International Business Machines.
And at the very heart of this new culture, at the core of everything, was a single, powerful word. A concept he actually brought with him from his dark days at NCR that would become the soul of IBM.
The story behind this word is it's fantastic. It was literally born in a moment of pure anger. He's at this dead-end sales meeting at NCR, and he just loses it. He shouts, "The trouble with every one of us is that we don't think enough." And then he grabs a notepad and just scribbles that one word in all caps. And that became his 5-letter gospel for everything he wanted in an employee: initiative, smart analysis, and, actually solving problems. But the man who preached think, well, he was anything but simple himself. He was a walking contradiction, really. A bizarre mix of incredible compassion and just absolute tyranny. And this just perfectly illustrates that paradox, right? On one hand, you have the man who, after an employee was in a fatal car accident, personally set up a $5,000 account to pay for the family's hospital bills. An incredible act of kindness back then. And yet, this is the same guy who would publicly humiliate his top execs for not correcting a report that he was the one who misread. At home, he's the loving grandpa making his false tooth pop out to make the kids laugh. But he was also this terrifying father whose rage has sent his own children running for cover. Just two completely different people in one. Now, this very complex character was really put to the test in the 1930s. The Great Depression hits, the global economy is just on its knees. Pretty much every single company out there is firing people, slashing budgets, just trying to survive. But Watson, well, he saw an opportunity where everybody else just saw despair. So get this, in 1932, at the absolute lowest point of the Depression, he makes one of the boldest bets in business history. He invested $1 million, a staggering amount of money back then. It was almost 6% of IBM's entire yearly revenue. And he used it to build one of the world's very first corporate research labs.
And that quote right there, that was his whole philosophy in action. While the rest of the world was pulling back, Watson was pushing forward. He absolutely refused to be a victim of his circumstances. He believed in betting on the future, even when the present looked impossibly grim. And let me tell you, that decision paid off big time. It set IBM up to totally dominate the information age that was just around the corner.
But Watson's legacy isn't just about bold bets and building a culture. It's also clouded by some serious controversy, specifically his actions in the years leading up to World War II. And this leads us to maybe the toughest question about Thomas Watson. What exactly was the nature of his and IBM's involvement with Nazi Germany? The answer, as you can probably guess, is deeply complicated.
So let's just look at the facts we have from the source material, because they paint a really conflicting picture. First, we know that IBM's German subsidiary, a company called Dohamag, supplied the Nazi regime with its tabulating machines, and those machines were used to help organize census data that identified Jewish populations. Then, in 1937, Watson himself accepts a medal from Hitler for promoting global trade, an award he did eventually return in protest. And yet, the record also shows that Watson was privately using his own money and resources to help Jewish refugees escape Europe. So, it's a really unsettling part of his legacy, with no easy answers.
You know, in the end, Watson's greatest success might not have just been building an empire, but creating a dynasty. He pulled off something incredibly rare in business. He successfully passed the company on to his son, Thomas Watson Jr., and it was his son who would take that foundation and lead IBM into the computer age, overseeing its most explosive and historic period of growth.
Just as the New York Times wrote in his obituary, you really can't separate the company from the man. IBM's massive ambition, its obsession with image, that fierce culture of loyalty, and even its deep contradictions, they were all just reflections of Thomas Watson Sr. His personality was literally baked into the company's DNA.
So, that leaves us with one final big question. Watson's life really shows us that incredible achievement and deep personal flaws can exist in the exact same person. It kind of forces us to ask, what is the true cost of building an empire? And how do we even begin to measure the legacy of a man who was a visionary and a tyrant, a hero, and a deeply, deeply complicated figure?